Happy Mother's Day. Today is Mother's Day. So all you mothers here, happy Mother's Day to you. I'd like to take a look at the story of a mother in the Bible. Each year when Mother's Day comes, Mother's Day and Father's Day both they're always interesting ones to find a sermon for, because I want something that's meaningful and blesses mothers, yet at the same time I want it to be something that can be a little bit for everyone as well. And it's also a little bit awkward sometimes trying to figure out what will be meaningful for mothers, since I'm not a mother and I don't really know how it feels to be a mother or to have someone preach a sermon about that from a mother's perspective. But so this year I thought I'd like to take a look at the story of a mother from Scripture. And so we're going to look at Jochebed. The title of the sermon is Jochebed, a Woman of Faith. And we don't have a huge amount of scriptures about Jochebed, but we're going to look at Exodus chapter 2 as one of the scriptures that speaks about her. And that's a little bit of background. Actually, this morning in our Sunday school, we looked at a time when God called Abraham to be Abram at that time, to be the father of a nation, what would become a nation, who would be God's special people, God's chosen people. And he called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees to a land that he would lead him to. And Abraham didn't even know where that was, where he was going. Eventually he found out that it was the land of Canaan. God promised the land of Canaan to Abraham and his descendants. So he settled there near Hebron. He had a son named Isaac and two grandsons from Isaac, Jacob and Esau. And Jacob was the one who God would choose to continue that line. Jacob had 12 sons. And you probably remember the story about one of those sons whose name was Joseph, who his other brothers became jealous of him and sold him to some traders who sold him to be a slave in the land of Egypt. So through a series of events, and we're not going to go into all of that, but through a series of events, some of them very difficult, Joseph became second in command in the land of Egypt. That was quite a story. And the rest of Jacob's family ended up moving to Egypt because there was a great famine, and they moved to Egypt to escape that famine. Well, they settled there, and they were treated very well, and they were given the land of Goshen to live in, and they multiplied, and they grew strong. God had told Abram back in Genesis 15 that his descendants would be enslaved in a foreign land for 400 years. And they didn't know exactly what that would look like or when that would be. But here's what that says in Genesis 15, starting at verse 12. It says, "As the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. Then the Lord said to Abram, Know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. How would that make you feel if God told you that your offspring would be taken to another land that's not theirs and would become slaves there? Wow. I would just as soon not know that if that was going to happen, I think. But God told Abram that. But he didn't stop there. He said, But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried in a good old age, and they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." So God gave Abram a picture of what the story of his life and the life of his descendants would look like. Well, that's exactly what happened. In Exodus chapter 1, we see that story, how that Israel, the people of Israel, which is what Jacob's descendants were known as, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. They grew to be a mighty nation. In fact, when they got to go back to Canaan, there were over 600,000 of them. When they came to Egypt initially, I think there were 70. And when they got back to the land of Canaan, there were 600,000 of them. That's a lot of people, but that's 400 years in between there. More than 400 years. So what happened after Joseph died? Remember, he was the second in command. The Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, liked Joseph, and he had put him in a high place. Well, after both of them died, the Egyptians kind of forgot what had happened, and they became paranoid about the descendants of Jacob taking over. So they came up with a plan, and they made them slaves, and they treated them badly. They treated them harshly to try to beat them down, to keep them down. And, in fact, the new king commanded that all the male babies be killed. So 400 years had almost passed since they came to Egypt. So let's begin in Exodus chapter 2, verse 1. It says, "Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman." Does anyone know what their names were? Amram and Jochebed. That's right. I think it's in Exodus 26 that we find that, what their names were. We know that they are, that doesn't say it here, but we know from the whole big story that they already had two children, Miriam and Aaron. Well, Jochebed was pregnant with their third child. And she was waiting, they were waiting, because the king had made this decree that all the male babies will be killed. And I've tried to imagine what it would be like to be expecting a baby, knowing that if this baby is a boy, the king has decreed that he should die. I can't imagine what that would be like. It would be a huge conflict of emotions going on, looking ahead to the birth of that child, the waiting. The waiting part had to have been very, very difficult. There were a number of difficult parts to Jochebed's story, but this one had to be really hard. Some of you might be waiting this morning. I'd like to encourage you, don't despair in the waiting. The waiting sometimes is some of the most difficult parts. There are many people who are waiting for a child, like Jochebed was. She was expecting a child. There are some who would love to have a child and are waiting, hoping that someday they could have a child. But God hasn't blessed them with a child to this point. That's a difficult waiting. Some of you have experienced that. Some of you might be waiting for a wayward child to surrender to Jesus. That's a difficult waiting. Some of you are waiting to see your child again in heaven. That's a difficult waiting. Waiting is often hard. Like I said, it's often the hardest part. But whatever it is that you're waiting for in your life, I encourage you to rest in the goodness and the faithfulness of God. Don't lose sight of the goodness of God, and don't lose sight of the faithfulness of God in the waiting. Sometimes the waiting distracts us, and we become discouraged. And it hurts, and that's okay to feel that. but please don't despair in the waiting. Rest in the goodness and the faithfulness of God. I'd like to look at the result of Jochebed's faith. How do we know that she had faith? Well, in Hebrews chapter 11, Jochebed and Amram are listed there, not by name, just says the parents. It says in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents, because they saw that the child was beautiful, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, here's what happened, going back to Exodus chapter 2. It says that the woman, talking about Jochebed, conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. And I don't know what Jochebed and Amram saw in Moses. The historian Josephus says that God told Amram in a dream, in a vision, that their child would be the deliverer that had been promised to deliver the people after those 400 years. We don't find that in Scripture, so I don't know whether or not that's true. But that's what Josephus said. I don't know what it was that they saw, but they saw something special in Moses. And they believed God's promise. They believed in God's goodness, and they believed in God's faithfulness, and they acted accordingly. It says that, so they hid them. So backing up, if you had a child born and it was a boy, and you didn't give that baby up to be killed, and they found out, then your whole family would be destroyed. That was the way it worked. That was the way they put the pressure on. So what was a parent to do? It was a really difficult place for them to be. Well, it says they were not afraid of the king's edict in Hebrews. They hid the child. When she saw in verse 2 of Exodus 2 that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes. So she was a person of action, it seems like. She wasn't just sitting around crying the blues or feeling sorry for herself. She came up with a plan, and I believe that God inspired her with the plan. She took for him a basket made of bulrushes and daubed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. Sorry, that was all one sentence. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, while her young women walked beside the river. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant woman, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. What more to tug at a person's heart than a crying baby, especially someone with a mother heart? She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So here they had Miriam, Moses' sister, watching to see what would happen. She was there ready. And when Pharaoh's daughter found baby Moses in the basket and was trying to figure out, I think, how to care for him, Miriam went and said, "Hey, should I find one of the Hebrew women to nurse him for you, since he's a Hebrew baby?" And she said, "Yes, do that." So they bring Moses back to his mother, and she's able to care for him, to nurse him. But not only that, but she got paid for it. Interesting how God's plan works. This child that was supposed to die, now his mom's getting paid to take care of him. Moms, wouldn't that be nice to get paid to take care of your children? So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, I drew him out of the water. So the result of Jochebed's faith was she acted. She didn't just sit there and do nothing. She acted on what she could do. And God blessed that. And he did some amazing things through Moses. If we go back to Hebrews chapter 11, starting at the next verse 24, it says, by faith Moses, when he was grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to be mistreated with the people of God than to enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin. He considered the reproach of Christ greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking to the reward. By faith he left Egypt, not being afraid of the anger of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. His faith in God was stronger than his fear of the king. He says he didn't leave Egypt because he was afraid of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith, he kept the Passover and sprinkled the blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn might not touch them. So because of the input that Moses received when he was a child, however long that was, that his family was able to care for him, his mother was able to care for him, they instilled in him a faith in God, and faith in the true God, not in the gods of Egypt. Just because, and that followed through, and you see how that it showed itself in his life and the way that he lived. Just because a mother has much faith and is faithful to God doesn't mean that her children will automatically do the same. However, without the faithfulness of a mother, the odds of her children being faithful drop dramatically. So moms, you do make a difference. You can't control everything that your children do, the choices that they make, but you make a huge difference. Moses had a choice, and his mother's faith set him up to be faithful too, just like she was. But the choice was his. Would he follow her example, or would he turn his back on God and be sucked in by the Egyptian culture and the Egyptian religions? Well, thankfully, he made the correct choices, and he followed his mother's example. And I'm assuming his father's example as well. Jochebed's faith was strong in difficult circumstances. Her faith was tested by hard trials, difficult things. It wasn't an easy time for her. You too will experience trials of your own that will test your faith. I heard a story about a little boy who spent a lot of time, many hours, making his little boat. And then he took it to the lake, and he had a string that he tied to the boat, and he was holding the string in his hand and sailing this little boat in the lake, and he was having a lot of fun with that, until the string slipped out of his fingers, and a breeze carried the boat out further than what he could reach it. So he started crying. He was sad because he had lost his boat. And he appealed to his older brother for help. Well, what did his big brother do? Well, he grabbed some big rocks and started throwing them out there in the direction of the boat. Well, that made him cry all the more, because here his brother, who he appealed to for help, was trying to sink his boat. It made it even worse. You ever feel like that? Well, pretty soon he noticed that his brother wasn't hitting the boat, and he was a pretty good aim. But he realized that he was throwing him past the boat, and they were making big waves, like you know how it does, a circle of waves kind of coming out, and it was pushing the boat. Every time he'd throw it, it would push it closer and closer to the shore. So finally, he was able to get his boat again. Sometimes it feels kind of like that in our lives when we're in a difficult position and it feels like God's throwing. Have you ever felt like God's throwing rocks at you? Many of us have. On top of our pain, more pain, or what feels like possible trouble on top of trouble. God is using those experiences in our life, those difficult things in our life. He will use those if you'll allow him to direct your life in the way that he needs you to go. In those difficult times, again, I encourage you, please don't despair. Hold on tight to the goodness and the faithfulness of God. He cares. He loves you. And not only that, but he's able to see you through. Hold on to those truths with all the strength that you have and see what he does in the end in those difficult times. Thankfully, Moses chose to follow the example that he was given, and God used him in mighty ways. So like I said before, mothers, your faith makes a difference. I'm thankful for a mother who was an example of strong faith that set me up for an easier time in my relationship with Jesus. That's priceless. So mothers, your faith makes a difference. Everyone else, your faith makes a difference. There are people who are watching you. No matter who you are, someone is watching you. You're impacting lives, no matter who you are. So I'd like us to consider, what impact are you making? Those who are watching you, what are they going to take from your life? Will your life be making it easier for them to follow Jesus? Or is it going to be making it more difficult for them to follow Jesus? Are there inconsistencies in your life that don't look like Jesus that will make it more difficult for those who are coming behind you to follow Jesus? Those things make huge impacts in the lives of those who are following us. You might think, oh, it's not that big a deal. Yeah, it is. It's a huge deal. What example are you leaving? That's my question that I would leave for us today. And again, I want to thank you mothers who have been faithful. No, you're not perfect. So don't beat yourself up when you don't do everything exactly right. God doesn't look for perfection. He looks for faithfulness. Keep doing the best that you can and leave the rest to God. I want to give you opportunity